I was working in the office when my coworker suddenly sent me a message asking for help. The thing is, he's been dead for 2 weeks. I stared at my phone and refreshed the app just to be sure it wasn't a bug, but it was still there in my inbox, sent just 3 minutes ago. Even his status showed active, in focus mode, with a green dot. I practically ran to HR and showed her my screen with Nico's message. She pulled up his file and frowned, turning the monitor toward me. Nico's status says deceased. Death certificate filed 14 days ago. Life insurance claim processed. You know what? This might just be a glitch. She phoned the IT to check the system. While she was on the phone, I went back to my desk and pulled up a project that was assigned to the team. There were fresh comments, new functions, bug fixes with his signature style of naming variables. It had to be him. My hands started shaking as I replied to his message on Slack. Dude, what's going on? Aren't you dead? He replied instantly. I am. Just forget I spoke to you. His status went offline after that, but I couldn't let it go. He had a family, a successful career, even a promotion right before the accident. He wasn't the type to run. So after work, I drove straight to Nico's house and asked to speak with his wife. She answered the door with red eyes and tissues in hand and invited me in. Everyone said I was crazy when I told them he was still alive somewhere, but no one would listen. She blew her nose into a tissue and continued. The police said he died instantly, that no body could be recovered because the car exploded on impact. I tried to tell them that there had to be more going on. That same week, Nico had been weirdly agitated. He kept checking the windows, the locks on our doors. I asked her if he'd said anything about work. She nodded and wiped her eyes. He said he discovered something at work that could get him fired or worse. I told him to go to the police, but he said he needed more proof first. Then she paused and looked at me carefully. The night before he died, he grabbed my shoulders and made me promise something. He said if anything happened to him, don't trust Ray. My mouth went dry. Ray was our manager. He had been nothing but supportive since Nico's death, even taking on extra work himself to cover the projects. I was up all night thinking about everything that had happened. That's when an email popped up on my personal inbox saying, "Stop digging or you'll be next." But just knowing that Nico could still be out there somehow, I couldn't stop. I went over to the IT department the next day and went straight to my friend Vincent. He was the only person I trusted who had admin access to everything. I showed him Nico's messages and the threat. "Will you help me? We just need enough evidence to go to the police and reopen the case." Vincent locked his office door and began accessing Nico's work email account together. There, we found cryptic exchanges between him and Ray from the week before the car crash. Nico had warned Ray, "I'm going to report this to the CEO if you don't explain. Now." And Ray coolly responded with, "Let's meet tomorrow morning, before you do anything rash." Vincent pulled up Nico's calendar and confirmed that he had a scheduled meeting with the CEO and HR about an urgent compliance matter. Suddenly, Nico's account went active again. Vincent's fingers flew across the keyboard. I can trace the IP in real time if he's online now. The location popped up on his screen just before Nico disappeared again. The address led to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, 40 minutes away. Vincent reached for his phone, already calling 911 when I grabbed my keys. "Give them the location. I'll head there first myself." The warehouse looked like it hadn't been used in years. Broken windows, rusted doors, weeds growing through the concrete. I found a broken window and saw Nico on the other side, chained to a desk with 3 monitors in front of him. He looked exhausted, unshaven, wearing the same clothes from weeks ago. I quickly pulled out my phone, snapping pictures while I looked around for the entrance. Just then, the door slammed open and Ray walked in carrying a gun and a duffel bag stuffed with cash. "Project's done. Time to clean up loose ends." He pulled back the safety. Nico's voice was hoarse. "You promised you'd let me go when I finished everything. What about my daughter?" Ray laughed. "Oh, you believe that? Can't have witnesses to embezzlement, Nico. You should have minded your own business." I accidentally knocked over a trash can trying to get a better view just before the trigger was pulled. Ray spun around and pointed the gun at me, shaking his head. "Seriously? I left you a warning. Doesn't anybody read these days?" That's when we heard the sirens. Ray looked at the window, then at Nico, then at me. "You sly son of a beach." He stuffed the rest of his money in a bag and booked it just as the police burst through the door. The officers started to chase him when Nico screamed at the top of his lungs. "Wait! My daughter, please!" He pointed to one of the monitors showing a video feed of a teenage girl at dance class being watched from a distance. The police split up. They tracked down the daughter and arrested the accomplice, but Ray escaped. But 2 hours after giving our statements, our phone buzzed. A Slack message from Ray appeared with a video attached. My wife and Nico's wife were tied up, crying with duct tape covering their mouths. "Miss me? One last project. 48 hours. No police this time. I knew I had a decision to make. I played the video again with my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. Both wives were sitting on a concrete floor with their hands tied behind their backs and duct tape across their mouths. My wife's eyes were red and puffy from crying, and Nico's wife looked terrified. Ray's voice came through cold and flat as he explained exactly what he needed: an audit purging script that would wipe backup logs from 3 specific servers and replace them with clean copies. He gave me 48 hours and said if I contacted police again, he would disappear with both of them forever. My hands were still shaking, but something weird happened in my brain, where everything suddenly got really clear and focused. I couldn't give Ray what he wanted because that would destroy all the evidence against him, but I also couldn't just do nothing while he held our wives hostage. I pulled up Vincent's number and called him right away. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear the stress in his voice when he asked if I was okay. I told him we needed to meet somewhere away from the office where nobody could hear us. He suggested a coffee shop 3 blocks away from work that was usually pretty empty in the afternoon. I drove there in about 10 minutes and found Vincent already sitting at a corner table looking pale and scared. When I sat down across from him, he leaned forward and asked what was going on. I pulled out my phone and showed him the video without saying anything. His face went white as he watched it, and his jaw muscles got really tight. He watched it twice, then looked up at me and said we were calling the police no matter what Ray threatened. I wanted to agree, but I was worried Ray might be watching our phones or computers somehow. Before we did anything else, I needed to test if he was monitoring my communications. I opened Slack on my phone and typed out a careful message to Nico, asking if he was okay, and if he needed anything. Vincent watched me type it and understood what I was doing. The message showed as delivered, but Nico didn't read it right away. We sat there staring at my phone for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 minutes. Then Nico's status changed to active, and he read the message. His response came through with just one word: trapped. My stomach dropped because that meant Ray probably had Nico under surveillance too, or maybe even had him somewhere else. My phone buzzed in my hand, and a new message from Ray popped up. This one was way more detailed than before. He listed specific server names that matched our company's backup system. He included protocols for accessing the audit logs and exact procedures for replacing them with clean versions. The level of detail made me feel sick, because these weren't things I could fake my way through without serious technical help. Ray had clearly thought this through very carefully and knew exactly what he needed. I showed Vincent the message and he read it twice, then looked at me with worried eyes. I typed back a response to Ray asking for current proof that both wives were still alive. I told him I needed to see today's newspaper or phones, showing today's date and time as verification. My fingers were steady as I typed, but Vincent must have noticed my hands trembling because he reached across the table and squeezed my shoulder. Ray responded faster than I expected. Within 15 minutes, he sent another video. This time, both women were holding up their phones with the screens facing the camera. I could clearly see today's date and the current time displayed on both screens. Ray's text message came right after the video warning that any police involvement meant he would disappear with them forever, and we would never find them. The relief of knowing they were alive crashed into a new wave of terror about making the wrong choice. Vincent and I looked at each other across the table, and he said we had to call the police anyway, because we couldn't do this alone. I agreed, and we got up and left the coffee shop. We walked for about 20 minutes until we reached a park 2 miles away from the office. Vincent pulled out his personal phone instead of his work phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, he asked to be transferred to major crimes. The dispatcher sounded skeptical and asked what this was regarding. Vincent explained we had information about corporate embezzlement and kidnapping with a ticking deadline. The dispatcher's tone changed immediately, and she said she was transferring us. We waited on hold for maybe 2 minutes. Then a detective picked up and identified himself. Vincent explained the basic situation while I stood next to him listening. The detective asked us to stay where we were and said someone would meet us within the hour. 3 hours later, we were sitting in an unmarked police car parked outside a closed library. Detective Colin Hall sat in the driver's seat and listened to everything without interrupting once. I showed him both videos from Ray and the technical demands message. Vincent explained about finding Nico in the warehouse and Ray's embezzlement scheme. Detective Hall stayed calm the whole time, and when we finished talking, he laid out a plan. He said we would cooperate in a controlled way that kept us safe while building a case against Ray. His calm, professional manner made me feel like maybe we could actually survive this whole thing. Detective Hall made a phone call, and 20 minutes later, another car pulled up. A woman got out and walked over to us. Detective Hall introduced her as Cameron Pitts and said she was a cyber specialist. Cameron got in the back seat with Vincent and me and immediately started asking technical questions about our company's systems. She understood everything way better than I expected. She asked about our backup protocols and audit logging systems, and Vincent answered most of her questions. Then Cameron explained her plan. We could build a dummy script that would look completely functional to Ray, but would actually contain hidden trackers. The script wouldn't destroy any real audit trails, but it would trace back to wherever Ray executed it from. She said we could preserve all the evidence while making Ray think he was getting what he wanted. Detective Hall asked how long it would take to build something like that. Cameron looked at me and Vincent and said if we worked together we could have a preliminary version ready in 12 hours. That would buy us time while she embedded forensic hooks into the code. I felt like I could breathe normally again for the first time since seeing Ray's video. The plan felt solid and real, but the weight of knowing 2 lives depended on my technical skills sat heavy in my chest, and I knew the next 12 hours would be the hardest work I had ever done. Detective Hall pulled out his phone and started dialing before I could even process what was happening next. He put the call on speaker and waited while it rang 3 times before Nico's wife picked up. Her voice sounded tired and wary when she answered. Detective Hall introduced himself and explained we needed to talk about a situation involving her husband and her safety. I heard her breath catch, and she asked if Nico was hurt. Detective Hall kept his tone calm and professional as he laid out the basics without revealing too much over an unsecured line. He told her that Nico was safe for now, but that Ray had made threats, and she needed to follow specific safety protocols immediately. Her voice cracked when she responded, and I could hear her trying not to cry. She asked what kind of threats, and Detective Hall explained that Ray had taken hostages to force cooperation and that her family might be targeted next. She went quiet for several seconds, and I thought maybe the call had dropped, but then she spoke again, asking what she needed to do. Detective Hall gave her clear instructions to pack a bag for herself and her daughter, leave the house within 30 minutes, and go to a specific address he would text her where officers would be waiting. She agreed without hesitation and said she would grab her daughter from a friend's house on the way. Detective Hall thanked her for her cooperation and reminded her not to tell anyone where she was going or why. After he hung up, I felt a small measure of relief that at least Nico's family would be protected, even if everything else went wrong. Detective Hall turned to me and said it was time to make sure my own wife understood the danger too. My hands felt cold as I pulled out my phone and scrolled to her contact. We had set up a code phrase years ago after watching too many spy movies one weekend, laughing about how ridiculous it was that we would ever need something like that. The phrase was simple and completely random, which made it perfect. I was supposed to say something about checking the attic for old photo albums. She would respond with a comment about finding grandmother's recipe box. If either of us deviated from the script, it meant we were in trouble or being monitored. I hit the call button, and she answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful and normal. I forced my voice to stay casual as I asked if she remembered where we stored those old photo albums, the ones from before we got married. There was a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Then she responded perfectly, asking if I meant the ones near grandmother's recipe box. My chest loosened slightly, and I told her yes, exactly those ones, and that I needed her to do me a favor without asking questions right now. Her tone shifted immediately to serious, and she said she understood. I explained that some police officers would be contacting her within the next hour, and she needed to follow their instructions exactly. She asked if I was safe, and I told her I was working with the police on something important, and that I would explain everything later. She said okay, and told me to be careful. I promised I would, and ended the call before my voice could break. Vincent had been sitting quietly in the back seat during both calls, but now he leaned forward and suggested we needed to get corporate involved somehow. He pointed out that we were going to need access to company systems and resources to pull off Cameron's plan, and if we just started making changes without authorization, we would trigger security alerts that would expose everything. I realized he was right, and pulled up my contacts to find Cassandra Kwan from compliance. I had worked with her once before on a security audit, and she had impressed me as someone who understood both the technical and legal sides of corporate operations. I sent her a text message carefully worded to sound urgent, but not alarming, asking if she had time for a meeting about a critical security concern. She responded within 3 minutes, saying she could see me in her office within the hour. Her quick response and serious tone told me she already sensed something major was happening. Detective Hall drove Vincent and me back to the office building, and we agreed to meet up again after my meeting with Cassandra. Walking into the building felt surreal after everything that had happened in the past few hours. The lobby looked exactly the same as it always did, but I felt like I was moving through a completely different reality than everyone else around me. Vincent and I took the elevator up to the compliance floor and found Cassandra's office. She was waiting for us with the door already open and gestured for us to come in quickly. She closed the door behind us and locked it before sitting down at her desk. I started explaining the situation from the beginning, showing her the videos Ray had sent and the messages demanding the audit purging script. Vincent pulled up Nico's draft report on shell vendors and the threatening exchanges between Nico and Ray from the week before his supposed death. Cassandra listened without interrupting, and her expression grew more serious with each new piece of information. When we finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a moment, Then she leaned forward and said she could create a sandboxed environment that would look exactly like our production systems, but would actually be completely isolated. She explained this would let us deliver something to Ray that appeared functional while protecting the actual company data and preserving all the evidence for law enforcement. Her quick understanding and immediate willingness to help, despite the potential liability to the company, made me trust her completely. She started pulling up technical documentation and making notes about what systems we would need to replicate. My phone buzzed with a new message, and my stomach dropped when I saw it was from Ray. He was demanding to know why I was taking so long on what should be a simple script and asking if I was having second thoughts about cooperating. I felt my pulse spike with the pressure of his impatience and the fear that he was getting suspicious about the delays. I typed back carefully explaining that I was being thorough to avoid triggering automated security alerts that would expose what I was doing. I told him I needed another 6 hours to test everything properly. His response came back almost immediately. He said 6 hours was acceptable, but not a minute longer, and he attached a short video clip. I opened it with shaking hands and saw Nico sitting in what looked like a different location than the warehouse, his hands zip-tied behind him and fresh duct tape across his mouth. Ray's message said this was just a reminder that he was watching everyone and could make things very painful if I tried anything clever. The video was clearly meant as a warning that Nico was still under his control and still in danger. I showed the message to Cassandra and Vincent, and their faces went pale. Cassandra said she would have the sandbox environment ready within 4 hours, and that she would personally oversee every configuration to make sure it was perfect. Vincent said he would help coordinate the technical setup while I worked with Cameron on the actual script. We split up to start working, and I headed back down to meet with Detective Hall and Cameron. They were set up in a conference room that Detective Hall had somehow gotten access to, with Cameron's laptop connected to multiple external monitors. She had already started building the framework for the decoy script and was working through the forensic beacon code. I sat down next to her and watched as her fingers moved across the keyboard with intense focus. She explained each component as she built it, showing me how the script would appear to scan backup systems and purge audit logs while actually doing nothing destructive. Instead, it would report back detailed information about where it was executed, what credentials were used, network configuration, and any other systems it touched. Watching her work with such focused intensity gave me something concrete to hold on to instead of spiraling into panic about the deadline. Hours passed in a blur of code and testing. Cassandra sent updates about the sandbox environment configuration, and Vincent coordinated with her IT team to make sure everything looked authentic. Around midnight, Cameron leaned back from her laptop and announced the script was ready for initial testing. We ran it through several scenarios in a completely isolated test environment, and it performed exactly as intended. The fake audit purge looked completely convincing, while the forensic beacons transmitted everything back to Cameron's monitoring systems. Detective Hall made phone calls coordinating with other officers and legal teams. At some point, Vincent came back into the conference room carrying food he had picked up from a 24-hour diner, and we ate quickly without really tasting anything. My exhaustion was so complete I could barely keep my eyes open, but the adrenaline and fear kept me functional. Vincent pulled up Nico's email account again to review everything we had, and that's when he found something we had missed before. Buried in Nico's drafts folder was a detailed financial anomalies report he had apparently been working on but never sent. Vincent opened the attachments, and we found a comprehensive list of shell vendors complete with addresses, fake tax identification numbers, and transaction patterns going back 2 years. The scope of Ray's embezzlement scheme was so much bigger than we had realized. The numbers added up to easily hundreds of thousands of dollars, siphoned through fake vendors and falsified expense reports. I felt sick looking at the evidence of just how long Ray had been stealing and how carefully he had covered his tracks. Detective Hall reviewed the vendor list and immediately started making calls. He contacted an on-call judge and explained the situation, requesting emergency subpoenas for 2 of the vendor accounts that showed the largest recent transfers. The legal process moved faster than I expected, probably because the kidnapping charges gave everything extra urgency. Detective Hall's phone rang an hour later and he answered with a terse greeting. His expression shifted to something like satisfaction as he listened, and then he thanked whoever was on the other end. He hung up and turned to us saying the warrants had come through and financial investigators were already pulling records. I felt a surge of hope that we were building a real case against Ray, not just stalling and hoping for the best. The evidence was piling up, and even if something went wrong with the hostage situation, we had enough to put Ray away for a long time. But that thought immediately made me feel guilty, because the priority had to be getting both wives back safely, not just building a legal case. Ray sent another message 2 hours later demanding proof the script actually worked before he'd accept any final delivery. I set up a screen sharing session from Cassandra's isolated sandbox environment and called him using the burner number Detective Hall had cleared for monitored communication. Ray answered on the second ring, and I walked him through connecting to my shared screen while Cameron watched from another room with her forensic tools running in the background. My hands stayed completely steady on the keyboard as I opened the script and started narrating what each section supposedly did, pointing out the backup scan routines and the log replacement functions. Ray watched in silence as I executed the demo against Cassandra's fake production environment, and the script appeared to systematically identify audit files and mark them for deletion. The sandbox showed exactly what we wanted Ray to see, a convincing simulation of his embezzlement evidence disappearing, while the real audit trail remained completely untouched on actual company servers. I kept my voice calm and technical as I explained each step, making sure Ray understood the script's capabilities without revealing that everything he was seeing was carefully controlled theater. Cameron sent me a quick text confirming her monitoring systems were capturing everything from Ray's connection without triggering any alerts on his end. The demo ran for about 12 minutes before I closed the session and asked Ray if he had any technical questions about the implementation. His voice came through the phone sounding less hostile than before, almost relieved, and he made a strange comment about how others were waiting for this to be finished and he couldn't afford any more delays. The phrase sent ice through my whole body because it clearly suggested Ray wasn't working alone or was under pressure from someone else involved in the scheme. I ended the call professionally and immediately looked at Vincent, who had been listening on speaker, and we both had the same worried expression because this conspiracy was apparently bigger than just one manager stealing money. Detective Hall came into the room right after I hung up and asked what Ray had meant by others, and I admitted I had no idea, but it made the whole situation feel more dangerous. Cameron called my cell about 10 minutes later with urgent news that her forensic tools had picked up a new IP address from Ray's side during the screen share, something that hadn't appeared in any of our previous traces. She explained the location traced to somewhere near a community center on the east side of town, about 15 minutes from the office. Detective Hall immediately grabbed his radio and started coordinating with a plainclothes surveillance team to check out the location without alerting anyone to police presence. He pulled up a map on his laptop and marked the community center's address while making calls to position officers in the area. I sat there feeling this weird mix of progress and fear, because every new piece of information brought us closer to finding the hostages, but also revealed how carefully Ray had planned everything. The surveillance team reported back within 20 minutes that they had eyes on the community center and identified a man sitting in a dark sedan in the parking lot. Detective Hall put the call on speaker so we could all hear the updates in real time as the officers described the suspect's appearance and ran his license plate. My anger flared hot and sharp when the plate came back registered to Jace Westbrook, the accomplice who had been arrested at the warehouse for watching Nico's daughter. One of the officers confirmed through binoculars that Jace was definitely watching the community center's main entrance where a dance class was currently in session. Detective Hall pulled up Nico's family information and verified that his daughter attended dance classes at that exact location on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The realization that these people were actively threatening a kid made me want to drive over there myself and drag Jace out of that car, but Detective Hall kept his hand on my shoulder and told me to stay calm. He asked for my input on whether to arrest Jace immediately to protect Nico's daughter or maintain surveillance to avoid alerting Ray that we were onto his network. The choice felt impossible, because I wanted that girl safe right now, but I also knew that tipping off Ray could mean both wives getting hurt. We went back and forth for a few minutes discussing the risks, while the surveillance team waited for instructions, and my stomach twisted with the weight of making a call that could go horribly wrong either way. Detective Hall finally suggested a compromise where officers would maintain close surveillance with a rapid response team positioned to intervene instantly if Jace made any move toward the building or the girl. I agreed, even though it felt like gambling with a kid's safety, and Detective Hall radioed the plan to his team, while I felt physically sick about the calculated risk we were taking. The surveillance officers confirmed they had Jace covered from multiple angles and could reach him in under 10 seconds if needed. Cassandra came back into the conference room carrying her laptop and asked to speak with Detective Hall privately, then changed her mind and said I should hear this too. She explained she needed emergency authorization from the CEO to quietly freeze Ray's internal system privileges and flag all his accounts for monitoring without alerting him to the changes. Corporate legal was apparently very nervous about liability and wanted every single action documented perfectly to protect the company from potential lawsuits. Her warning added another layer of pressure to an already impossible situation, because now I had to worry about corporate politics on top of everything else. Detective Hall assured her that everything we were doing had proper legal authorization and oversight, and he offered to have prosecutors contact the company's legal team directly. Cassandra nodded, but looked stressed as she explained the CEO was in meetings all afternoon, and she might not get approval for several hours. I delivered Ray the time-locked build about an hour later, uploading it to a secure transfer site and sending him the access credentials. The build was configured to only execute during a specific 4-hour window the next morning, which I explained to Ray as necessary to avoid conflicting with scheduled system maintenance windows. Ray questioned the restriction at first, suspicious about why I was adding limitations, but I walked him through the technical reasoning about backup schedules and monitoring systems. He eventually accepted the explanation and confirmed he would test the build during the designated window. Cameron used the extra time to coordinate with her forensic team and set up additional monitoring tools that would capture every detail of the script's execution and trace the callback to Ray's location. Ray sent another video right at the 24-hour mark, exactly on schedule, like he was making sure we understood he was serious about his deadline. Both wives looked more exhausted and frightened than in the previous video, their eyes red and faces pale. Ray's voice came through clear and cold as he repeated that I had exactly 12 hours left to deliver the final working build with no restrictions or time locks. The deadline pressure made it hard to think straight, and I realized I hadn't actually slept in over 30 hours. My eyes burned and my hands shook slightly as I watched the video again, trying to see any clues about where they were being held. Vincent admitted he was scared about losing his job and maybe facing criminal charges for helping me access systems we weren't supposed to touch. His voice cracked a little as he talked about his mortgage and his kids, and how he couldn't afford to be unemployed or in legal trouble. I was completely honest with him about the risks, and told him he could step back now, that I wouldn't blame him for protecting himself and his family. Vincent shook his head and said we were seeing this through together, that he couldn't live with himself if he walked away and something happened to those women. His loyalty meant everything to me in that moment, even though I felt guilty about dragging him into such a dangerous situation. Cassandra pulled me aside right after that conversation to warn me that corporate legal wanted to frame this entire situation as a rogue actor narrative that would protect the company's reputation. She urged me to document everything I did with precise detail and keep copies of all communications and authorizations. Her warning made me frustrated because I cared way more about saving lives than managing corporate spin or protecting some company's public image. But I also understood she was trying to help me protect myself from potential legal problems later, so I thanked her and promised to keep detailed records of everything. The next morning, Cameron called me into a small conference room where she had 3 monitors set up showing spreadsheets and maps. She pulled up Nico's shell vendor report on one screen and Ray's expense reimbursement records on another screen. Her fingers moved fast across the keyboard as she highlighted addresses in yellow. 4 of the vendor cities matched exactly with trips Ray had claimed for business conferences. She zoomed in on the dates, and my stomach dropped when I saw the fund transfers happened within 24 hours of each expense claim. The pattern was so obvious, it felt like we were finally building something solid that prosecutors could use. Cameron printed out the correlation charts and said this was the kind of evidence that juries understood because it showed clear intent and planning. I felt a weird mix of hope and terror, because even as we built the case, the clock kept ticking toward Ray's deadline. My phone buzzed with an urgent text from Detective Hall, saying there was a situation at the community center. I drove there as fast as I could and found 3 patrol cars blocking the parking lot entrance. Detective Hall met me near the tennis courts and explained that Jace had apparently noticed the surveillance team. I watched officers running toward the far end of the lot where Jace had abandoned his car. The foot chase lasted maybe 90 seconds before 2 officers tackled him near the dumpsters behind the building. My immediate reaction was pure adrenaline-spiked fear that Ray would somehow find out his accomplice got arrested and hurt the hostages. Detective Hall must have seen the panic on my face because he grabbed my shoulder and said they would control the information flow completely. No media, no public records, nothing that would tip off Ray before we were ready. I tried to slow my breathing and trust that they knew what they were doing. 2 hours later, I sat in an observation room watching Detective Hall interrogate Jace through a one-way mirror. Jace looked like he was about to throw up. His hands shook as he wiped sweat off his forehead. Detective Hall stayed calm and methodical, laying out the charges Jace was facing, including kidnapping and conspiracy. Jace broke down within 15 minutes. He admitted Ray paid him $5,000 to watch Nico's daughter and report her location twice a day. His voice cracked as he insisted he never touched the kid and didn't know where the wives were being held. Jace was clearly terrified and not the mastermind type. He kept saying Ray told him it was just surveillance for a custody dispute. Detective Hall pressed him about the hostages, but Jace swore he only knew about the daughter surveillance job. I felt frustrated that we couldn't get the location directly, but at least we had someone talking. Detective Hall asked Jace if he had any way to contact Ray. Jace nodded, and his voice shook as he said Ray gave him a burner phone number for daily check-ins. He pulled out his own phone with trembling hands and showed Detective Hall the contact saved as a random string of numbers. Jace begged for leniency, saying he had a kid of his own and couldn't go to prison. Detective Hall's expression shifted slightly, and I could tell he thought this phone number was valuable, even if Jace couldn't give us the hostage location. Detective Hall stepped out of the interrogation room and immediately called Cameron to start tracing the burner number. I felt a small surge of momentum, like maybe we were finally getting somewhere despite how scared Jace looked, and how little he actually knew about Ray's full operation. Cameron worked some kind of legal magic to get what she called a pen register trap, and trace order approved by a judge in under an hour. She explained it would let her capture metadata from Ray's burner number without actually alerting him that we were monitoring it. I sat next to her in the police tech room watching lines of data scroll across her screen. Within 2 hours, she identified a pattern of calls originating near a storage unit complex on the industrial side of town. She pulled up a map and circled the area in red. The lead felt solid, and my exhausted brain latched onto the hope that we were getting close to finding where Ray was hiding. Cameron said the call pattern showed someone making regular check-ins from that general area at the same times each day. Detective Hall started making calls to get a search warrant for the storage facility. My phone lit up with a new message from Ray, asking why Jace hadn't checked in on schedule. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse spike. Ray's message had a suspicious edge to it, like he sensed something was wrong. I forced myself to stay calm, and typed back a lie about Jace mentioning he was switching to new communication protocols for security reasons. I hit send, and hoped it would buy us a few more hours before Ray realized his accomplice was sitting in a police interrogation room. Detective Hall read my response over my shoulder and nodded approval. The waiting felt horrible. Every minute that passed without Ray responding made me more anxious that he would figure out what happened and do something terrible to the hostages. Finally, my phone buzzed with Ray's response saying he understood and would wait for the new contact method. I exhaled hard and felt like we dodged a bullet, at least temporarily. Cassandra showed up at the police station around midnight carrying a hard drive case. She looked as tired as I felt. She handed the case to Cameron and called it the final build package. Cassandra explained her technical team worked all night to make it look completely authentic. The package would simulate the backup purging process convincingly in isolated test environments, but couldn't actually destroy the real audit trail. She walked me through the technical details, and I was genuinely impressed by how thorough they were. Every log file, every timestamp, every system response was designed to make Ray think it worked perfectly. I felt real gratitude for Cassandra's commitment to helping us, despite all the corporate pressure she was under. She squeezed my arm and said she hoped this would end soon, and everyone would get home safe. The exhaustion in her voice matched how I felt. My phone buzzed again, and I saw a new message from Ray that made my blood pressure spike. He said he changed his mind about the delivery method and wanted a physical drop of an encrypted drive instead of a digital file transfer. Everyone in the room went quiet when I read it out loud. Detective Hall's jaw tightened. The physical drop meant I would have to get close to Ray's operation somehow. It meant actual face-to-face danger instead of digital distance. Detective Hall immediately started making calls to coordinate a safe plan. Cameron said she could hide GPS trackers inside the drive casing, so we could follow wherever it went. The preparation started happening around me, but I felt a heavy dread settling in my chest about being physically exposed to whatever Ray had planned. Vincent called to check on me, and I told him about the new requirement. He offered to do the drop instead, but I said no because Ray was expecting me, and any change might spook him. Detective Hall spent the next 3 hours coordinating an elaborate exchange plan with his team. He showed me a map of the drop location Ray specified, a spot behind an abandoned grocery store. Undercover officers would maintain surveillance from multiple angles. Cameron would track the GPS hidden in the drive casing. Detective Hall went over the plan twice, making sure I understood exactly what to do and what signals to watch for. The preparation felt thorough and professional, but I couldn't shake the sick feeling in my stomach. This was real danger, not just computer screens and phone calls. Detective Hall asked if I was sure I wanted to go through with it. I nodded because what choice did I have with my wife and Nico's wife depending on us? He handed me a tiny earpiece so I could hear his team during the exchange. The weight of it in my hand made everything feel more real and more terrifying. That night, I sat alone in my home office and opened my laptop camera. I hit record and started talking directly to the lens. I explained everything that happened, from finding Nico alive to discovering Ray's crimes to ending up in this impossible situation. I talked about why I made each choice and why I couldn't just walk away. Speaking the words out loud to the camera made the danger feel crushingly real. My voice cracked a little when I addressed my wife directly and told her I loved her, and I was sorry for putting her through this. I recorded a separate section for Nico's wife, explaining that her husband was a good man who tried to do the right thing. The whole video was maybe 8 minutes long. When I finished recording, I saved it with instructions to send it to both families if something went wrong at the drop. I sat there staring at the file name on my screen and felt the full weight of what I was about to do. But I also felt my resolve crystallize into something hard and clear, because these women deserved to come home, and Ray deserved to face justice for everything he did. The morning air felt cold against my face as I walked behind the abandoned grocery store, carrying the encrypted drive in my jacket pocket. Graffiti covered the brick walls and broken glass crunched under my shoes. I spotted the trash bin exactly where Ray said it would be, sitting against the loading dock about 20 feet from the back entrance. My hands felt steady as I pulled out the drive and dropped it into the bin, making sure it landed on top of the other garbage so the runner could grab it easily. I walked away at a normal pace, resisting the urge to look back or speed up. 3 minutes passed while I circled around to the front of the building. That's when I saw him. A young guy, maybe 20 years old, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He jogged up to the trash bin like he was just taking a shortcut through the alley. He reached in, grabbed the drive without breaking stride, and kept moving toward the street. My heart started pounding hard in my chest as I watched him disappear around the corner. Detective Hall's voice came through my earpiece. Quiet, but clear. We've got him. Teams are in position. Stay where you are. I leaned against the grocery store wall and tried to look casual even though my legs felt shaky. The next 20 minutes dragged by while I waited for updates. Detective Hall's team followed the runner through 3 different neighborhoods. The guy got into a beat-up sedan, drove for maybe 10 minutes, then switched to a different car in a parking garage. Cameron's voice crackled through the radio saying the GPS tracker was still sending signals. The surveillance teams had to rotate positions constantly to avoid being spotted. I could hear the tension in everyone's voices as they coordinated movements. The runner made another vehicle change at a strip mall, this time getting into a white van. Detective Hall muttered something about Ray being extremely careful with his handoffs. The whole operation felt like it was balanced on a knife edge. One wrong move and the runner would know he was followed. Finally, the runner arrived at a gas station on the east side of town. He parked the van, walked inside to buy something, then came back out and handed the encrypted drive to someone in a black truck. The new person drove off immediately. Cameron confirmed the GPS was still transmitting, and the new vehicle was heading toward the industrial district. I sat down on the curb and put my head in my hands, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. Detective Hall told me to go home and wait for updates. The waiting turned out to be worse than the actual drop. 2 hours later, Cameron called my cell phone directly. Her voice sounded excited in a way I hadn't heard before. She told me the decoy script had executed in a test environment somewhere. Ray, or someone working for him, had actually run the code to verify it worked. The execution triggered her forensic callbacks exactly like she planned. She explained that the callbacks gave her new data about the testing location and network configuration. I asked what that meant in normal person language. She said it meant they now knew Ray was using a server farm about 15 miles outside the city, and they could trace the specific machine that ran the test. The breakthrough felt huge, even though I only half understood the technical details. Detective Hall called me 10 minutes after Cameron did. The pen register on Ray's burner phone had captured a brief cell tower ping near the storage unit complex he'd mentioned before. He sounded pumped up about it. He said he was requesting an emergency search warrant right now based on the kidnapping charges and all the evidence we'd collected. I asked how long it would take to get approval. He said probably 90 minutes if the judge was available. The waiting started again. I paced around my living room, unable to sit still or focus on anything. Every few minutes I checked my phone, even though I knew Detective Hall would call the second he had news. 75 minutes after his first call, Detective Hall called back to say the judge granted the warrant. Officers were mobilizing to hit the storage unit complex within the next 30 minutes. I asked if I could come with them. He said absolutely not. This was a tactical operation and civilians stayed clear. I understood, but it didn't make the helpless feeling any easier to handle. My phone buzzed with a new message while I was staring at the wall, trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. The message was from Ray. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. The text said I had exactly 24 hours left, and then he was cleaning house. Those 2 words, cleaning house, felt like ice water in my veins. We all knew what he meant. He was going to kill the hostages. I immediately forwarded the message to Detective Hall and Cameron. Detective Hall called back within 60 seconds. His voice had changed from excited to deadly serious. He said the explicit threat just moved everything into high gear. Every available resource was now focused on finding those women before Ray's deadline hit. I could hear people shouting and moving around in the background of his call. The whole investigation had shifted into a different mode. I felt this weird mix of terror and determination settle into my chest. 24 hours. That's all we had left. Detective Hall's team approached the storage unit complex like they were entering a war zone. I sat in an unmarked car 3 blocks away, listening to radio traffic through the earpiece they'd given me. Officers were using careful, tactical language, calling out positions and sight lines. I heard someone say they had eyes on Unit 217, the one listed in Ray's records. Another voice confirmed no movement visible through the small window. My hands gripped the car's door handle so tight my knuckles turned white. The radio crackled with the breach command. I heard the metal door being forced open, then several voices calling clear as they moved through the space. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Detective Hall's voice came through saying the unit was empty of people. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. The disappointment hit so hard I actually had trouble breathing for a second. All that work, all that planning, and we still didn't know where the wives were being held. One of the officers said they were finding surveillance equipment, personal items, and boxes of financial records. Detective Hall told everyone to preserve the scene for evidence collection. I slumped back in the car seat, feeling totally defeated. We were running out of time and running out of leads. 10 minutes passed while the officers photographed and cataloged everything in the storage unit. Then one of them called out that he'd found a notepad with handwritten codes. He read the codes over the radio. Cameron's voice cut in immediately, sounding excited again. She said one of those codes matched an internal server designation that Nico had flagged in his draft reports about the shell vendors. The small breakthrough made me sit up straight. Maybe Nico's investigative work was still helping us even now. Detective Hall ordered the notepad bagged as evidence and told everyone to wrap up the scene. He said we had a new lead to chase down. I felt a tiny spark of hope push back against the panic. We weren't done yet. Cassandra called me directly about 30 minutes later. She'd pulled the access logs for the specific server Cameron identified. The logs showed off hours access by Ray, using a contractor badge that shouldn't have had those kinds of privileges. She walked me through the timeline of his access patterns. He'd been logging into that server late at night and on weekends for the past 6 months. The level of planning and preparation was scary. This wasn't something Ray threw together at the last minute. He'd been setting up his embezzlement scheme and covering his tracks for half a year. I realized we were dealing with someone much more dangerous and sophisticated than I'd originally thought. Ray wasn't improvising or panicking. He'd planned every step of this from the beginning. Detective Hall brought Jace back in for another interview session. Jace had been sitting in a holding cell since his arrest, probably thinking hard about his situation. Detective Hall told me later that Jace was desperate to negotiate a better plea deal. He wanted to avoid serious prison time for his role in watching Nico's daughter. During the interview, Jace suddenly remembered something Ray had mentioned during one of their conversations. Ray had talked about a rural property he used for secure deliverables. Jace couldn't remember the exact address, but he described the general area. He said it was about 40 minutes outside the city near some farmland. Ray had mentioned it was quiet and private, perfect for handling sensitive work. Detective Hall's eyes apparently lit up when Jace provided those details. Finally, we had something concrete to work with, an actual location to investigate instead of just digital breadcrumbs and financial records. Detective Hall immediately started pulling property records for the area Jace described. I felt the momentum shifting again. We were getting closer. Detective Hall gathered everyone in a conference room and laid out a map of the rural area Jace had described. He pointed to several properties that matched the general location and explained his two-part plan. His team would prepare a tactical response to hit the most likely property, while I made contact with Ray to force him into a mistake. The coordination felt complicated, but Detective Hall walked through each step with calm confidence that made me believe we could actually pull this off. He assigned specific roles to each officer and made it clear that hostage safety was the absolute priority over capturing Ray. Cameron pulled up satellite images of the target area on her laptop and started marking entry points and potential escape routes. I watched her work and realized how much planning goes into something like this compared to what you see in movies. Detective Hall turned to me and said I needed to text Ray right now, demanding fresh proof both wives were alive before I'd hand over any final access keys. My hands felt steady as I pulled out my phone, even though my heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. I typed out the message, trying to sound confident and businesslike rather than desperate or scared. The text read simply that I needed current verification before proceeding with final deliverables, and that this was non-negotiable. I hit send, and everyone in the room went quiet watching my phone. Ray responded in less than 3 minutes, which surprised me. The message contained a photo of both wives sitting against a concrete wall with their hands still bound, but the duct tape removed from their mouths. They each held up a phone displaying today's date and the current timestamp. My wife's eyes looked red and exhausted, but she was alive, and that's what mattered right now. Nico's wife had a bruise on her cheek that made my stomach clench with anger. I showed the photo to Detective Hall, who immediately forwarded it to Cameron. She opened the image file on her computer and started running it through some kind of analysis software I didn't understand. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up data about the photo's metadata and embedded information. She zoomed in on the background and adjusted the contrast and brightness levels. After about 5 minutes, she got excited and called Detective Hall over to look at something. She pointed at the lighting in the photo and explained that the frequency pattern of the light source matched a specific type of industrial ballast. These ballasts were common in older duplex buildings constructed in the 1970s, according to utility company databases she was accessing. The technical details sounded almost like magic to me, but I'd learned to trust Cameron's nerdy expertise completely over the past 2 days. She cross-referenced the lighting analysis with Jace's description of the rural area and started pulling up utility company records. She filtered for properties that used cash payment systems and had no official tenant history in the database. The search narrowed down to 3 possible locations. Detective Hall studied each property's details and eliminated 2 based on their proximity to main roads and neighbors. The remaining property was a rental duplex about 45 minutes outside the city near farmland, exactly like Jace had described. Everything suddenly clicked into place, and the room felt electric with focused energy. Detective Hall grabbed his radio and started coordinating the tactical response team. He gave orders for officers to gear up and move to staging positions near the target property. The speed of everything happening made my head spin, but I forced myself to stay focused. Detective Hall told me I'd be waiting in an unmarked car 3 blocks from the duplex where I could monitor radio traffic but stay clear of any danger. I wanted to argue that I should be closer, but one look at his face told me this wasn't up for discussion. The tactical team assembled in the parking lot, and I watched them check their equipment and review the operation plan. They moved with practiced efficiency. That would have been impressive if I wasn't so terrified about what they might find. We drove in a convoy to the staging area, and the 45-minute trip felt like hours. My leg bounced nervously the entire drive, and Detective Hall didn't tell me to stop. We parked 3 blocks away from the target duplex, and I could hear the tactical team's radio communications through Detective Hall's equipment. The team approached the property from multiple angles using the cover of some old farm equipment and overgrown bushes. My hands gripped the door handle so tight my knuckles went white. The radio crackled with status updates as officers confirmed their positions around the building. Detective Hall's voice came through calm and steady, giving the authorization to breach. I heard the tactical team announce themselves, and then the sounds of the door being forced open. The next 30 seconds felt like an eternity of radio silence. Then an officer's voice came through, reporting they'd found both wives in a basement room. They were dehydrated and terrified, but alive and breathing. My knees buckled with relief, and I had to sit down hard in the parking lot where I'd been standing. Tears streamed down my face, and I didn't even try to wipe them away. Detective Hall squeezed my shoulder and told me they were bringing the wives out now. Through the radio, I heard officers calling for medical personnel and reporting that both women were responsive and talking. One of the people who'd been guarding the hostages tried to run out the back of the duplex. A woman in her 30s, according to the description, fled through the rear door, and officers chased her across an empty field. They caught her after a brief pursuit and brought her back in handcuffs. During her booking at the station later, she apparently gave up information about a meeting location where Ray had planned to collect a final payment from whoever else was involved in the embezzlement scheme. Medical personnel arrived at the duplex and started evaluating both wives right there at the scene. They checked vital signs and started IV fluids for dehydration before making the decision to transport them to the hospital for complete checkups. A woman named Emmeline Shepard, who worked as a victim advocate, arrived to coordinate their statements and help with ongoing safety planning. Detective Hall told me I could have a brief phone call with my wife before they transported her. I took the phone with shaking hands and heard her voice for the first time in 2 days. She sounded weak and shaky, but strong enough to tell me she loved me and that she'd been so scared. I told her everything was going to be okay now and that I'd meet her at the hospital. Hearing her voice made everything we'd been through feel worth it, even though I knew we still had to deal with Ray. After the call, I told Detective Hall I needed to be part of the controlled meeting with Ray to finish this properly. He started to argue that it was too dangerous and that I'd done enough already. I insisted that Ray would be suspicious if I suddenly disappeared from the communication chain and that I needed to see this through to the end. After significant back and forth, Detective Hall finally agreed, but he set strict boundaries about my role and made it clear I'd follow his safety protocols exactly. Vincent called and volunteered to come with me to the final meeting, but I convinced him he'd done more than enough and needed to stay clear of any confrontation. The meeting location Ray had mentioned to his accomplice was a parking garage downtown, according to the information the arrested woman provided. Detective Hall's team spent hours planning how to control the environment and position officers throughout the structure. They gave me a wire to wear and rehearsed exactly what I should say and do. The plan was for me to hand over a USB drive containing what I'd claim was the final access key while plainclothes officers positioned themselves on every level of the garage. We arrived at the parking garage 2 hours before the scheduled meeting time, so officers could get into position without being spotted. I waited in a car on the 3rd level, watching the minutes tick by on my phone. Ray showed up exactly on time, driving a different car than I'd ever seen him use before. He parked 2 spaces away from where I was standing and got out, looking edgy and paranoid. His eyes constantly scanned the garage for any signs of a trap or surveillance. I forced my hands to stay steady as I walked toward him holding the USB drive. My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral and businesslike. Ray demanded to see the drive first before any conversation, and I handed it over without argument. He pulled out a laptop from his car and plugged the USB drive into the port to verify the contents. Cameron's tracer software immediately activated and pinged his exact location to every officer in the area. Ray's face changed as he stared at his laptop screen, and I saw the moment he realized something was wrong. Detective Hall's voice came through the hidden speakers announcing police presence and ordering him to surrender. Ray's hand moved toward his jacket, and I thought he was going for a gun, but instead he threw the weapon away and bolted for the stairwell. Officers moved in from 3 different directions as Ray ran. They caught him 2 flights up where the concrete stairs turned sharp and his shoes couldn't grip the dusty surface. 2 officers hit him from behind, and he went down hard with his face smashing against the steps. Ray started screaming before they even got the cuffs on him. His voice bounced off the walls of that empty stairwell, and he kept yelling about how he could take the whole company down, and he knew where all the bodies were buried. The officers yanked his arms behind his back and clicked the metal cuffs tight, while he thrashed and threatened to expose everyone. I stood there watching from the landing below, and felt this weird mix of total relief that we got him, and complete exhaustion from everything that happened, and also this sick worry about what other corruption he might actually know about. His threats kept echoing even after they pulled him to his feet and started walking him down the stairs past me. He looked right at me with pure hate in his eyes, but I just stared back until they took him away. The next 6 hours turned into a blur of repeating the same story over and over to different detectives and prosecutors in different rooms at the police station. My brain felt like mush, and I could barely form sentences that made sense. But I kept pushing through because knowing we stopped Ray and saved both wives kept me going. Cassandra showed up around hour 3 and worked with the IT security team to lock down all the systems and preserve everything for the investigation. She moved between rooms with her laptop showing people logs and files while I sat in that cold interview room drinking terrible coffee and trying to remember exact dates and times. Every detective wanted to hear about the warehouse and the USB drive and Ray's messages, and I told the story so many times the words stopped feeling real. My voice got hoarse and my eyes burned from being awake so long, but whenever I started to fade, I'd picture my wife's face in that video and force myself to focus. Cassandra caught my eye through the window at one point and gave me this small nod that said, "We did the right thing," and I held on to that. 2 days later, the company called Vincent and me into HR and told us we were being placed on paid administrative leave while they did an internal review of our actions. The HR director used all this careful language about policy violations and unauthorized system access, and I wanted to scream that we literally saved people's lives, but I just nodded and signed the paperwork. Vincent looked crushed when we walked out together, and I felt this burning frustration that we helped solve this whole mess, and now we're being punished for it. But I also got why they had to investigate, because their systems got compromised, and they needed to figure out how it happened. That same afternoon, some reporter started calling my phone asking questions about an incident at the company, and I realized facts about the case were leaking to local media. The news coverage stayed pretty vague with phrases like alleged financial crimes and ongoing investigation, but everyone at work would know it was about us and Ray. The administrative leave felt like punishment, even though I understood the company's position, and I spent the next few days at home feeling restless and angry and worried about whether I'd even have a job when this ended. Nico got to see his family 3 days after Ray's arrest at some secure location the police set up with protective watch. Detective Hall called me that afternoon and told me Nico completely broke down crying the second he saw his wife and daughter walk through the door. The detective's voice got softer when he described how Nico just collapsed and held on to them while they all cried together. Hall said Nico agreed to provide full testimony about everything Ray did and all the embezzlement details and his whole captivity. Hearing that Nico was finally reunited with his family made me feel genuinely happy for the first time since this nightmare started. At least one good thing came out of all this mess, and that family didn't have to keep living with the lie that he was dead. I imagined his daughter getting her dad back, and it made some of the exhaustion and stress feel worth it. Hall mentioned they'd keep the family under protection until Ray's trial, just in case, and I felt grateful the police were taking their safety seriously. The prosecutors moved fast on filing charges, and within a week, Ray was facing counts for kidnapping, extortion, embezzlement, conspiracy, and a bunch of other things I couldn't keep track of. Jace apparently saw which way things were going and started negotiating a plea deal where he'd testify completely truthfully about everything in exchange for a lighter sentence. His lawyer reached out to the prosecutors, and Jace gave up details about Ray's whole operation, including the shell vendors and the fake accounts and how long it had been going on. The legal process was moving way faster than I expected, probably because the evidence was so overwhelming with all the logs and videos and financial records. Detective Hall said the prosecutors felt confident about conviction on most charges, and Ray's lawyer was already trying to negotiate too, but the DA wasn't interested in any deals. Every few days, I'd get updates about new evidence or new charges, and it felt like watching this massive criminal case build itself piece by piece. The speed of everything surprised me because I thought legal stuff took forever. But I guess when you have kidnapping and clear digital evidence, things move differently. Cassandra called me during my administrative leave to tell me the company was conducting a full external audit of all financial systems and implementing new whistleblower protection policies. She sounded tired but determined when she explained how they were bringing in an independent firm to review everything and make recommendations. The CEO held some big meeting where he framed the whole situation as a managerial breach by one bad actor, instead of admitting there might be systemic problems that let Ray get away with this for so long. That corporate spin bothered me because it felt like they were protecting their reputation instead of taking real responsibility, but I was too exhausted to fight about how they controlled the narrative. Cassandra promised the reforms would be real and meaningful, even if the public messaging was sanitized, and I chose to believe her because she'd proven herself trustworthy through everything. The company also announced they were cooperating fully with law enforcement and conducting their own investigation, which at least sounded better than trying to cover things up. I just hoped the external audit would actually find problems and force changes instead of being some rubber stamp exercise. 2 weeks after they arrested Ray, I drove over to Nico's house and we sat on his back porch drinking beer and talking about everything that happened. The afternoon sun felt warm and normal, and almost strange after all the chaos and fear. Nico told me his daughter was having nightmares about being watched, and his wife jumped at unexpected sounds, and he could see how the trauma was affecting them. I admitted I was having trouble sleeping too, and kept checking my phone obsessively, and felt paranoid about people following me. We both acknowledged the cost of stepping up when it mattered, and how our families would be dealing with this for a long time. But then Nico looked at me and said he'd make the same choices again, because living with the fear of Ray hurting his family would have been worse than anything that actually happened. I agreed, and told him I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd ignored his messages and let Ray keep getting away with everything. We sat quiet for a while, just watching his daughter practice dance moves in the yard, and I felt this deep relief that she still got to have a dad. The conversation wasn't easy or comfortable, but it felt necessary and honest, and I left his house feeling less alone with everything I was processing. A month after the whole crisis ended, both families were safe, and Ray was sitting in jail waiting for trial, and Vincent and I were back at work with official commendations in our files, despite the initial administrative leave. The company went through with the external audit and actually implemented real reforms, including new financial controls and anonymous reporting systems and mandatory ethics training. Nico was working with prosecutors to help them build cases against the whole shell vendor network, and his testimony was apparently going to be crucial for multiple trials. None of us were fully healed from the trauma, and I knew we'd all be dealing with the effects for years, but we were moving forward with our ethics intact and our families protected. I started seeing a therapist to process everything, because the nightmares and anxiety weren't going away on their own. My wife and I were closer than we'd ever been, because going through something that intense together either breaks you apart or bonds you tighter, and we chose the second option. I learned that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting messy outcomes and trusting that safety and justice, even when they're imperfect, are worth fighting for. Vincent got promoted to a senior security role, and Nico was talking about maybe writing a book about corporate fraud. Ray's trial was scheduled for 6 months out, and I'd have to testify, but I wasn't scared anymore. The whole experience taught me that ordinary people can stand up against corruption when they choose courage over comfort, and I'd carry that lesson forward into whatever came next.